Mississippi is renowned for its rich literary culture, attracting readers, writers, and book lovers from far and wide each year to the annual Mississippi Book Festival. Right On Mississippi presents Matt Sawyer with Joseph Earl Thomas, author of God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, a novel about an ex-Army vet struggling to find themselves between attending medical school and working as an EMS in a North Philly hospital.
So I haven't had an Otis Spunkmeyer muffin in gotta be 10 years. I couldn't even tell you the last time. But I drove after work on Wednesday, stopped in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I'll be danged if downstairs in the lobby, there was not an Otis Spunkmeyer muffin.
They're everywhere. They're inescapable, you know?
And I don't know why. I was like, how have I not had one in this long? And it was because of reading your book that I even noticed it. And so I picked it up and brought it with me so we can have it on the table as a token of it's a good omen, like a good Lord bird.
Yeah.
The muffin here. And it was just such a treat to read your book. And as I said, it was unusual, but not in like the passive Midwest way where you're saying a negative thing by saying it's unusual. Right. Truly, it was a one of a kind experience in the way that Tyreek felt with his book too. So I just really thank you for writing it. But the thing I want to start with, and I know you've talked about this before, but I was really interested in the setting of the hospital instead of the high school. And it came from, so have you heard of Eduardo Berti's book, Ideal Presence?
No, I haven't.
He spent a ton of time in a hospital interviewing people. He was going to write a nonfiction book, and he ended up turning it into a novel.
Okay.
And then I talked to my friend in Minneapolis who loved that book, and she was explaining why she loves hospital settings so much. And I think you can speak to that with your answer to this question of why you chose to set it in a Philadelphia hospital.
I mean, it's like the thing that comes to mind immediately is that you have a forced social relation between all these different kinds of people that you don't usually get in any other kind of case, right? And by that, I mean, from the range of people who come in who are ill, but also the kinds of people who work there as well, from like all of the techs and nurses' aides, et cetera, to physicians, like the range of kinds of people of different class positions, especially who are interacting with each other or forced to interact and would otherwise never do so. In other ways, it feels like opposite of the literary world sometimes, you know,
Truly.
In which I feel really alienated coming into literary spaces. The hospital felt more like a second home to me. And it's also like it has its own diction. It has its own syntax. It has its own kind of presence that is hard to repeat. And, you know, a couple of things I was thinking about is like, I wanted to write about work in particular, because I think it's important that I don't know a lot of people who have leisure time at all. And I wanted to be like, okay, what are the things that are being captured in a certain kind of workplace? And that job is so tied to other jobs because you have people who are coming in from not just workplace injuries, for example, but they're put out of that. And a lot of times they're just like, look, you know, things are horrible right now. I'm just trying to get back to work on one end. And that, I think, so the worst moment in your life happens. You come to the hospital and the only thing you can think about is getting back to work, and the way that we're conditioned or forced to live that way.
Yeah.
And it's related to these other institutions that I'm interested in, right? Being like, of course, the prison and the military. There's like a kind of triangulation of it. And especially in a place like Philadelphia, where you have a lot of hospitals, and then you have people coming to those hospitals from prisons. And my experience in healthcare started from the military.
I mean, there was no time to spare in any of this. And there was an urgency in everything. And it was very stressful to read. I mean, there was like with all of that going on, I think you picked the right setting because all these lives are passing and you're having to deal with it. But then you also are very reflective. I love things that have a structured unstructure, you know, or even just full blown lack of structure. I think sometimes we formalize everything, but I'm curious, you know, you talked at the end of the book, like, thanks for giving it a shot to the publisher, but you know, why not write a more formal structure for that book? Why do it the way you did, where everything went into the next thing and there wasn't even room to breathe, really?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. And you know, it's kind of a group of concerns that I have generally, which is like, well, if we all already agree on some basic point or principle, and, you know, I say we with, you know, the best intentions of assuming most of us have some degree of care about, the world being better than it is, let's say like largely construed or something, right? I sometimes get in this funk where I'm reading a lot of stuff by people that I generally agree with politically, morally, socially, whatever, about like a kind of large scale issue. But then I'm also like, why do so many of the things sound the same? And how do you break up that monotony of it sounding the same? I mean, this is on one end like a voice/style thing that's really important to me. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was like, like there hasn't really been a break in any real way with like 19th century European novel form. And a lot of times it's like we're doing little tweaks to that and then, selling it. And it's true that will sell better usually, and that will, kind of allow one to continue writing, like you said. But then on the other end, I'm like the aboutness or like the content I think is very similar, and I want to be able to break up the stylistic conventions and the kinds of things that we think we're able to do or not able to do in a sentence, while also thinking about some of those relationships to power. And there's this thing that Gayatri Spivak says about humanities education being something like about the non-coercive rearrangement of desires. And to me, that is really vital as a resource, because I don't think that I can convince somebody of something by just being like, did you know X was bad? It's like, well, duh.
Yeah.
Well, duh, right? So, but I think if you can invite somebody into a world or the way that a particular mind works, that might be able to guide them to a place where you are both coming up or into conclusions together. And that kind of work is very different than the kind of, for lack of a better word, directly didactic or the kind of 101 relationship that you might have to, like, let's say power relations, whether it's anything from like race to colonialism or something like that.
There was an interview where you said in this book you were trying to refuse the two obvious demands on what I was supposed to write.
Yeah.
And how, about harm reduction, abolition, assumptions about the power of empathy.
Yeah.
And then there's the one at the end that got me was the tenderness industrial complex.
Yeah.
I'd really love to hear you talk about that, just because I've never seen it phrased that way, but I think it's an important thing to talk about.
Right. I mean, it's this relation that's, so on one end, and this is especially true in conversations about men or male power, especially, the sense that we need to learn how to be more tender with each other and other people, especially. And it's related to like harm reduction, of course, and more tender to ourselves, which feels to me like pretty clear and obvious. Like I don't really have any qualms with that in particular. And I think that is something that takes consistent practice that everybody should be attempting to do. On the other hand, I'm also interested in the way that once we admit something to ourselves publicly, it just becomes a part of the social contract, and we must just keep saying it over and over again, as if the saying it is like part of solving the problem. And what I'm interested in is like, well, okay, let's talk about how you formulate and think about something like tenderness and empathy in the spaces where we need to, which is when you don't like other people or they are doing harm to you or you are doing harm to them, and not necessarily in a like directly kind of didactic thing, but like what are some of the circumstances in which that might be really difficult. And then there is where I want to find there is where I'm excited in thinking about something like tenderness and empathy, where you have such a high level of conflict, but you don't want to just punish people or discard them. That's the thing that I'm interested in.
So there's no time to really dwell on, how might I think about this person or treat them? It's you got to do it. So I think that idea of empathy and the practice of it is all over. But there was one scene in particular, and I don't know exactly why. Mm-hmm. This is the one that kept coming back to me and why I want to talk about it. But the Frederick Douglass scene.
Right.
Felt like a momentous occasion in the book for me personally. And it just tied a lot of things together. But there was this passage you had, why did someone in the late 20th century name their child Frederick Douglass? And why, like many schools named after MLK, did this person have to be so sickly and so dying and so bereft in this place hundreds of years later in this position? And how many times has he been to prison? 4 times, it turns out, though for mostly nonviolent offenses, the likes of which liberals can easily fold into a redemptive gesture. In other words, he might be salvageable.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the formation of that scene? Because it felt like it came out a little bit abruptly and hit me just like really hard. So I'm curious why you chose Frederick Douglass and that language.
A lot of reasons. So one of them is the problem of naming, has been always super important in like kind of African American literary tradition, right? The trouble with naming, what it means to finally be able to name yourself or not be able to do so. And and it's a true thing that often comes up in passing. It's like every MLK Boulevard, every time there's an MLK Boulevard, or every time there's like a MLK High, it's always, let's say, to some extent, disregarded or lacks the resources in which the area or the plate or the institution in which it might live up to the name of the figure, let's say, right? And I'm just so interested in that question, one. And then the other broad question that's just about current and kind of ongoing. And, these have been debates within Black cultural studies or more broadly about what our relationship to a kind of slave past is and how you reorganize those. Basically, like how you think about forms of subjection in particular differently, how they have changed or transformed or become less obvious in certain ways, and what are the gaps in what we are able to understand and think through, and how have we best explained some of those problems. And so having a figure like Frederick Douglass, or with that particular name, I think puts front and center the fact that, yes, it is true that a great deal of people come into the hospital and it feels like a certain kind of incarceration for them. And this is especially true about people who are mentally ill in any way, shape, or form. And that is like always a huge question for me, because I think that in that arena, those are folks who are often seen as the least salvageable. And often we don't even talk about that. That doesn't even become a conversation until way, way down the road, until one is at their absolute worst, right? You're already institutionalized. And I wanted to bring that kind of front and center and to have that go. And, I'm thinking a lot with scholars like Saidiya Hartman, for example, whose 1997 book, Scenes of Subjection, is incredibly important, and who I think does a lot of really sophisticated thinking about some of these problems, not just as a scholar, but in trying to invent new forms to have those conversations.
Yeah, because I think we can get stuck in the language we already know, the stories we've already been told, and like, what good has that done for a lot of people, And I think the Frederick Douglass thing stuck out too, because I realized when I was reading it, I thought about this school named after Frederick Douglass in South Georgia.
Yeah.
That I was in this really nice town. I interviewed this bookstore owner. It felt like a movie scene. I meander down the road, and there's a museum now there for this neighborhood, I think, but the school was shut down for years, and so it just kind of all came together with this scene where I'm just like, yeah, what's salvageable, and who gets to decide? And why does it even get to that point where you have to make that determination?
Yeah, as an individual, and then be treated as if the individual making the determination is like the one who set every problem in motion or something like that, It's really hard. I think it's related also to the role of like memorialization, which I think is like a kind of big motif. And I don't always know what to do with, because I am not one who leans into memorialization. And I'm very interested in like how basically, like how we give people their flowers now. I think a lot of people get memorialized and forgotten long after they have done a whole host of the work. And lots of people who we claim we love die sad and alone. And I kind of want to take both of those things serious at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's this interesting idea of action in this book that I'm particularly curious about with family.
Mm-hmm.
This quote really hit me too. Though she was right before, I was lonely. So lonely that what I wanted most of all was for her to quit the attempts to care for me and the claims of regret, so that we could be less so together, regretful and lonely. What were you thinking about when you wrote the relationships between Joseph and his mother and his father? And what did you mean by that? Because a lot of people might not be able to relate to that statement, and how you were hoping to get closer by actually quitting those attempts of care and regret and all the things that actually are preventing you from having the relationship you want.
With regards to like capital F family as a concept, there is the sense that should endlessly be repeated, even by people like the mother figure here in the book, who actually does not have the capacity to do that. Because in part there's a history and a set of expectations that she will do that. And what do we lose when we force people based on how they're formed as subjects to try and repeat things that do not work under these circumstances? And all it does in a lot of spaces is to frustrate the person who you claim to love and to have them frustrated at you. And I think sometimes in relationships, you can recognize this, right? Like you're in a relationship with someone who really claims to love you and they're putting a lot of energy into that relationship, but it's not the way that you can feel or that you need.
Yeah.
And basically, that's what's happening in the family relation here. It's like the example of the mother is like, this is what I'm supposed to do. The example of the son, this is what of the son is like, this is what I'm supposed to do, and on and on. And rather than being able to like break apart those old models that are failing, it's just like, no, let's keep banging our heads against the wall to try and do the same thing that we actually can't. And so something stranger, would have to happen in order for both people in that scenario to feel like they're loved by each other. But I think it's seen as, a certain kind of taboo still, as simple of a problem as it might be.
But there was so much that was carried home that you can't possibly let go of. So I'm curious about how you chose to write about someone from the military coming back from the Middle East and integrating back into another rather chaotic environment, and how those memories affected the choices that he was making day to day.
The thing that you don't do is to write about a kind of American war hero figure coming home who is like suffering his own psychic scars and is somehow like a hero for participating in the imperial project of the United States, right? That's a wild thing to do. So, that's the thing that I would never do, that I kind of reject, right? It's like, oh, woe is me, I agreed to murder people for the state and now I feel bad about it, right? Which isn't to say that one can't have kind of psychic wounds in that space, but I think it's more important for me to think like holistically about that. So one of the big, kind of monumental things that I'm trying to write against is a larger conversation about the thing that we call trauma porn or some version of that, right? Like where the scope of, even though I don't like that term, I think it's like a bad term, but whatever, right? But for where everything narratively can be boiled down to a particular bad thing that happened, and then the narrative proceeds from that and it kind of terminates with that as well. But more likely, and this is true about the kinds of folks that I'm writing about coming into the hospital and out of it, it's like there are many, many things that one could point to in your life that could have had that effect, right? So it seems strange to me to say like only one thing happened, like there are many, many things. And the joke that I had made talking before, I was like, oh yeah, depends on where you go. The VA hospital will say it's because of the bombs. The psychoanalyst will say it's because of what happened in your childhood and that stuff was bad. The school therapist will say you're overburdening yourself with too much coursework, etc. Or any number of things, or like it's the kind of global atmosphere or what have you. And I'm like, yes, it's all of those things.
Yeah.
And to my mind, the people that I care about most are dealing with all of those things every day, all the time, at once. And they can't so easily be individuated. And how do you figure out or create a kind of narrative that can hold some of those things? And that's one of the things I wanted to do. And so the fact that that the novel set in the trauma center is like deliberately because I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, sure. If you want to talk about it, let's talk about it. This is the place that you cannot leave.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that I write in there is like, oh, okay, well, maybe trauma is the only form of recognition or something like that.
It's hard to know what people are talking about when we're talking about trauma anymore.
Yeah.
But there was one particular connection between the hospital setting and what happened while Joseph was deployed. Was their friend dying?
I think about that a lot. And while I was deployed, actually, in Baghdad in real life, a friend of mine, made a comment. He's like, well, as Black dudes from like North Philadelphia, we're safer here because more of us were killed at home last summer than those of us that died overseas in that particular year.
Yeah.
And, which was just like factually true, right? And has a lot to do with the way that imperial power works abroad and at home. the differentiations and sacrifices you make when you align yourself with that power in some circumstances and not other circumstances. And I want to be able to like kind of thread that needle a little, at least a little bit, not to give, a full like expose on the thing, but to say, hey, here are some circumstances in which this thing happens. And, it's true that it's more likely, right, in that circumstance that this person would die at home from a whole host of things, right? The inability to integrate back into what we would think of as like civilian life is interesting to me because, you weren't able to integrate into it in the first place. I'm sorry, I'm cursing.
No,
like that's the problem. It's not that it's not just the movement. It's the fact that we've made life so difficult to live for so many regular people that failure of integration is not an individualized thing. And it's really strange to me sometimes when we use terms like a failure to integrate into civilian life, when we're like, yes, there's many of those kinds of people who we've made it impossible for to integrate into like the body politic or the sphere of concern or something.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I want to be able to get at with that, right? So it's the loneliness. It is the lack of kind of material resources, no matter how hard one might work. It is the kind of back-breaking set of expectations with regards to your life in every part of it, or in every kind of manifestation that does more harm than the individual experience of like, I have deployed or something like that.
Yeah, the way you integrated it was really, really wonderful. I mean, it helped me because, so this is the example of what you're talking about with the character of even how they're making a decision. You said some cross between freeways, if my kid's hungry, snatch the dishes at your kitchen, and conscious rappers who, despite incredible goofiness, have continued to carry the torch of Dudley Do-Right into our collectively burning future with a Coke and a smile. And I'm just like, that type of stuff is like you interject those types of lines in the book in a way that helps you understand even, why people are making decisions, what they're feeling when it's happening. Michelle Branch makes and strangely enough, I had not listened to Michelle Branch for years until my trip here. I drove from North Carolina and I was like, man, it's like T-Pain, Soulja Boy, Akon, Michelle Branch. Just hits. I was listening to all those hits because that's all they do is churn out hits. So I appreciated that because, like I said, with Tyreek White and his New York version of these cultural things that were occupying people's minds, it does help you get into the mind space of even like, what food do people eat? People eat when they're poor and in a certain area or don't have time. Which I guess brings me to the muffin we have on the table. We didn't address this.
I mean, it's blueberry, so technically it's not the best of the flavors, but I'll allow it for now.
What was it that made you use the Otis Spunkmeyer muffin as the title and a regularly appearing character in the story? Why was it that important to you to center this?
I mean, it's an interesting symbol of the kind of like pre-packaged, both formally, emotionally, with regards to convention and by force that I think a lot of us are conscripted into living, thinking, feeling, etc. Right? On a kind of literal sense, as a symbol of what are the kind of things that one is able to eat and what do they do to your body? How do they feel in particular? And on the other end, right, like there are more and more, I think, and this isn't to just be like, I'm going to shit on every food example that comes in a plastic package or something like that, right? I'm obviously eating Twizzlers. I was eating Twizzlers all yesterday while driving around. But it is to say it's one of these things that's so readily available, and so it happens to get taken up often. And where was it readily available? I was thinking in particular places like my public schools that I had gone to, prisons. Like one of the reasons that ended up coming in, there was my mother and grandfather would both say to me like, oh, I remember having those muffins in prison. And then in the military as well, right? And the hospital. So this item that gets passed around to all these different places, to which in my mind, like to some folks, those feel like very similar places.
Sure.
Let's put it that way. The public school, the prison, the military. So a lot of people, they feel like the same place. And, it was like, it felt like an unavoidable symbol altogether
Yeah.
in these things, especially in its like, in its, on one end, technical fragility, but repetition, right? It's a literal muffin that gets smashed in the pocket, but it's still there. And there are more, it's what's available, right? It's one of the foods that get given out to people at the hospital. And all the while we are like individualizing and blaming people for like, let's say having high blood sugar or blood pressure based on what they eat in these circumstances, and also giving them the thing to eat at the same time,
Yeah.
So for me, it's like it's a symbol of a really big problem area and kind of oversight.
This was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
And I just want to say again, everybody should read your book. It's an important story. It's one that I really do feel like geographically, for people who grew up where I did, live where I live, would be a blind spot. And now it's gotten me really energized to keep thinking about more authors I haven't read and that I can find when I'm not, having to read it for an interview. So thanks for spending time with us here. And I'm glad you got to come this year.
Listen, thank you so much for reading it the way you did.